What's new?
I'm Zev Elif, professor of Jewish history at Hebrew Theological College and Touro College, and I'm joined here with the reigning Lee Max Friedman Award Medal recipient, Professor Emerita of American Studies at the University of Minnesota, and a mentor of mine and so many others, Professor Riv-Ellen Prell. This segment is called What's New? About in American Jewish history, or now we're calling more frequently American Jewish Studies. Right. What is new? What is the work that's coming out that has appeared in the last 5 to 10 years? And where are there new areas to explore that aren't just filling new knowledge, but also challenge the rest of us to keep a pace and think of new creative lenses and ways to study Jews in the United States?
Well, thank you for that question. I enjoyed thinking about it because what I think is new is consistently what I learned from my colleagues of your generation and now younger generations. And I want to start with what I think was probably in many ways the most significant overarching change that I would put to around 2010 or a bit earlier. And that was American Jewish history and American Jewish studies lining up with transnational history. And it's so intuitive. Jews are diaspora people. They've lived all over the world. But the study of American Jews fell into the same pattern that the study of US history followed, which so often happens, which is the study of history within a national border. And even the study of immigration history, which is kind of hard to believe in 2020, but even then was in some way built all through the exciting work, honestly, that was coming out in the 70s and the 80s and thereafter of the old world was left behind. And what was interesting was innovation, persistence in identity, but a very new way of doing things in the US. Little interest in memory, little interest in the relationship between the old and the new world, maybe in some ideas, but really very much seeing what happened within the United States, the receiving part of the story of immigration. And US historians following global historians and then American Jewish history to follow that begins to rethink that paradigm and accepts pretty readily that national boundaries are fairly arbitrary when one is looking at a people, their cultures, their traditions, their ideas of family, gender, and other ways of negotiating the world. And the first person I think who really did that was Rebecca Coburn, who in 2010 published her book, Jewish Bialystok and Its Diaspora. I remember signing up for my copy at the Association for Jewish Studies and being the first person on the first list to get her book, because that was for me a profound moment when someone looked at the old world, the institution that Daniel Sawyer had done such a wonderful job writing about, the ethnic association, the Landsmannschaft, looking at it from Bialystok, one of the great centers of Jewish life in Poland, and seeing what happened to those Jews as they went literally all over the world, to the US, to Argentina, to other destinations, both before the Holocaust and then how those people contended with it. So she looks at how they become parts of the different places they go to, contrasts and comparisons, ideas that they develop about philanthropy, and she has an incredible trove through newspapers, through memory books. That was a really important step on the way to thinking about ourselves transnationally as a field. And then another book that I wanted to highlight that I think deals also with the other thing I want to talk about, which is the study of economy, is Adam Mendelssohn's book, The Rag Trade, How Jews Sowed Their Way to Success in the US and British Empire. That book is comparative. And the virtue of a transnational history is that it's always comparative, that it not only overflows boundaries, but that it calls on comparison. What happens to the Jews who go to one place or another? But Adam Mendelssohn, of course, focuses specifically on the rag trade, on clothing, and very carefully lays out the difference for British Jews and American Jews in their work in that shared field, how it changes, and how these Jews in these different countries have very different economic trajectories. He begins by saying people have said remarkable things about Jews, that they were oriented to success, that they had a culture that created them for success. Ideas that seem outrageous, but people really claimed. They had a natural affinity for business. And he does the excellent work of showing the structure, the politics, and the economy, so that making uniforms for soldiers in the Civil War and American women's taste for ready-to-wear clothing and a constant change in fashion leads American Jews, quite surprisingly, to a level of economic success that British Jews who identified there didn't have. So we have a transnational approach, asking a different set of questions and becoming quite comparative in the process.
The lift for both of them is striking. So with Rebecca Coburn, number one, what's also very striking is the amount of languages that she had to have a command over in order to access that.
Exactly.
And some of the images in the book. The Bialystok Center has a clock tower. And each segment of that diaspora reproduced the image of that clock tower, and they kept this web of this diasporitic community. And some of your work has been in economics. That would not necessarily have been possible 30 years ago for Jews in the United States to open up this Pandora's box of stereotype and study economics the way that we feel perhaps a little more comfortable in the last 5 or 10 years.
Yes. Another point to make about Rebecca Coburn's book is this is not a heroic or often flattering portrait of people who are dealing with the trauma and loss of the Holocaust and who care deeply for the world they come from, but they also are known to lord it over the people who didn't leave before the Holocaust, who approach philanthropy in ways that are often promoting their own ideas about status in the world they live in. So it's worth saying it's a very full portrait of all the complexities of those relationships between what we would say in quotes, home and diaspora. What those things mean are different for those communities. So yes, to build on what you're saying, the whole interest in the place of economy in history, again, reflecting what is going on in US history and following on it, is especially fraught for the study of Jews and economy because of the depths of anti-Semitism. Again, with the ideas of Jews' relationship to capitalism, whether that's in the work of Marx or others, as rendering them not fully human, as pariahs on larger societies. The word pariah used neutrally as a way to describe the Jews of Europe by Marx and Weber and others. But happily for us, scholars do move forward. Derek Pensler, who writes a little bit about the US, but more writes about Israel and Europe, does a wonderful volume about capitalism, and then some terrific studies come out roughly in the umbrella of what we would think of as the study of economy and capitalism. So again, I want to highlight just two because they're interesting. One is by Hasia Diner, whose book Roads Taken, The Great Jewish Migration to the New World and Peddlers Who Forged the Way was amazingly the first full study of peddlers, which seems impossible to imagine given how ubiquitous Jews' lives as peddlers, both men and women, were all over the world. I mean, talk about the diaspora. But I think Hasia Diner does something very interesting because in addition to using these critical tools of the study of economics that our colleagues use quite a lot with the notion of credit, merchandise, the niche economy, because Jews, like many immigrants, fill a particular niche, such as the rag trade. In addition to focusing on that, Hasia Diner looks at other aspects, though so does Mendelsohn, so does Michael Cohn, who we'll be talking about. She looks at the relationship, especially in rural areas in the United States, between the peddler and the housewife.
Yes.
What allows a non-Jewish woman to let a Jewish man step over her doorway and come into her life? Interactions in the South between Jews and African Americans, which was not done by white peddlers. Bringing new ideas about culture and consumption into the worlds of the peddlers. But what was especially interesting for me was that Hasia Diner's work looks at the women who stay behind, because peddlers, like my grandfather, both in Canada and the US, peddlers are gone for a long part of the year. And that means the women and children that they leave behind have to be quite self-sufficient. But in addition to that, it's the wives of peddlers who are really building the Jewish communities to which their husbands and fathers will return. So we can see very interesting gender patterns, marriage and family patterns that are created by peddlers. And Dinah is one of the few of our colleagues who work in this area who really pay attention to that. And that's just a great part of her book.
And for her, it's been many books. For her, it's been a series of books about different ethnicities that has moved her into this direction.
Yes. And then Michael Cohn has also written Cotton Capitalists, American Jewish Entrepreneurs in the Reconstruction Era, which is a large-scale study of the niche economy that Jews created somewhat before, but especially after the Civil War in the South, looking at the two components of that economy for Jews, the timing of it. And again, here this parallels what Adam Mendelsohn was doing. Look at structure, look at history, look at what's happening. But also, as almost anybody who works on Jews and economy anywhere, the critical place of ethnic relationships that cut across national boundaries. And in Michael Cohn's case, this is in part, as it is elsewhere, because Jews cannot get credit in the South. And he finds some incredible sources that show how credit is given and why Jews cannot get credit. So you turn to your kinspeople, you turn to relationships, no written documents, not much more than a handshake, sometimes not even a handshake because you are all over the world. These relationships are all often built through marriage. They may be, in cases of very elite people like the Rothschilds in Europe, the very basis for marriage, but in more humble environments, in-laws are as important as kin by blood. And these relationships make it possible to borrow money, to lend that money to people who will grow cotton, and then return to the Jewish merchants who will sell them in the small towns. Where Jews live, their relationship to ports. This is a complex analysis built on interests in niche economies. And by no means are Jews the only immigrants who are part of niche economies. Greeks are part of niche economies. Armenians are part of them. So we also have an interesting opportunity for comparison across ethnic groups who come at the same time to the United States. And I think in all of this work that I've mentioned, there's an interest in the ways that Jews are unique in America, that a Jewish culture emerges, or that Jewish kin relationships are critical, but also ways in which they are very, very much part of the United States. And I think that's something that your generation and others have really done a superb job of more and more grounding American Jewish history in US history, and also to some extent, of course, in modern Jewish history. So there's one third category that I also thought was really interesting, and that is just largely looking at Jews' relationship to others. Those might be people of color, they might be all kinds of people, but I think Sherry Rabin's book, Jews on the Frontier, Religion and Mobility in 19th Century America, is a terrific study of religion in the United States that does something else that I think has emerged increasingly in the last decade. These studies are excellent histories, but they also help us to really unpack the categories of what we mean by Jew, by Judaism, something you have written about, what we might mean by gender, what we mean by the family. These are excellent ways of understanding what religion is, because what Sherry Rabin does is find people who she's interested in space, she's interested in the mobility that's afforded by the United States. And she follows people who keep moving around, whose sense of Jewishness may change depending on where they're living, the form that Judaism takes, and the constant insistence of Jews in cities or larger population areas to count other Jews and to try to fix Jewish congregational membership, Jewish membership in something called a Jewish community. It's just a little overview of what I think has come out in part of transnationalism, which asks us to rethink national boundaries, boundaries between people, frontiers in the mind, as well as frontiers in physical space.
Thanks for clicking and learning. And here are some links to related videos. And subscribe. Don't miss out to making meaning of the past in the present for the future.